Hi, everyone. I know you're watching me look down at my screen as you are showing up, and I'm here, and I'm so happy to see you. And I think we are live on all of our channels. So welcome to Valley Beth Shalom. Welcome to our Thursday evening learning class. This is Rabbi Joshua Hoffman. That would be me, and you are at Valley Beth Shalom, and we are in the 5th class of our 6 classes of prayer mastery, which means that we have tonight's class and one more night's class, and then you're going to be masters of prayer for the high holidays. Hopefully, if we've accomplished our goal, you are curious and interested enough to learn more, and that is what really qualifies you as a master. Maybe know how to make your way through the machzor and make your way through some of the big ideas that are trying to be explored. And then you have the tools available to you to access the deep wisdom that's very present. So I'm happy to see you, and I'm so glad that you're here tonight. And tonight we are going to be delving deeply into one of the most profound prayers of the High Holiday Liturgy. It's the Unattainable Prayer. That's what it is called. It is upon us to give praise to God, who we stand in the presence of with great trepidation, because the book of life has been opened for us, and we are now measuring where we are inscribed in the book of life, and God forbid, where the book of our misdeeds fall. May they not fall in the book of death. What a tremendous place to begin. And as we're studying the text tonight, I just want to say something. This is like my disclosure. And also just know that there are many disclosures to add here. That the disclosure is that there are 2 books tonight. So I'm not the author of these books, but there are 2 books tonight which use expletives in their titles. And I need to refer to them, not because I just want you to know that that's a part of the language that I want to access, but it is important because the wisdom that these books contain, that expletives they're trying to encapsulate, may very well be the best words to use to describe the feelings. So the first thing is not written on the text that we're going to study tonight. And I'm just going to give by way of introduction of what we're discussing. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the Unattainable Prayer in particular. And this happens in the middle of a prayer service customarily after we have had sufficient time to have our own personal prayers and reflections upon the day. We've heard the Torah, so we've been a participant in the reception, the revelation of Torah as the holiday unfolds before us. And then we move into what is called the additional service, the Musaf prayer service. And for Jewish traditions all across the spectrum, including our Reformed communities, while it might not be considered a Musaf as an additional service, the theme is very much present. Okay, we talked about some of those themes in one of our other classes, but tonight we're going to be talking about what is actually transpiring in the prayer itself and what is the underlying theme. And for those who've been learning with us, we know we've tried to frame the high holidays as a journey, a liturgical journey, a prayer journey in which we are directors on the great production of our lives. And as we sit there and we're kind of like framing the scene and we're looking at all the contours and we're paying close attention to all the details and the script is being written, we realize that as much as we are the directors of our fate and our lives, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come to teach us that we are not the directors of life, that we are subject to the world, that there are things that compel us to change our narrative. And whether they're of the form of suffering, because sometimes we are afflicted with illness, not of our own accord, or sometimes we're klutzy and we fall into some kind of terrible accident and walk around with broken limbs and have a long time of healing. Or maybe we're suffering because we're afflicted of the mind. We have a sadness, a deep sadness that sometimes is so overwhelming that we can't even function. Or sometimes we're also not the directors of our fate when great joy is in our midst. It would be one thing if we were to say that the moment that we celebrate the life of a child that is being born is so perfectly manicured that the feeling that we're supposed to be experiencing at that moment is precisely the way that we have painted. But whether it's the birth of a child, or it's a celebration of love, or it's an experience of gratitude that you have of accomplishing some great success in life, there's a moment when the feeling transcends anything that you can create. And so therefore, these holidays give us that opportunity to make a connection with that point where we are no longer the directors of our fate alone, but we are actually part of a great drama that's unfolding. Perhaps a drama that has been given to us from generations before, and perhaps a drama that's unfolding before our very eyes right now. And the task of the holidays is to be very conscious of what scene we are setting for the next great production of our lives. And as we talked about Yom Kippur, part of the recognition in that moment is that even our best intentions of what we've created sometimes fall short. And so there is a need for us to recorrect and reevaluate whether our aspirations are truly achievable, or there really are aspirations that we need to redouble our efforts and renew our commitment to in this year to come. And then we get to this prayer. This prayer, in the metaphor of a stage production, is like being behind the curtain. It's what's happening on stage. All the while the script is being written, the lighting is being perfectly placed, the camera angles are being carefully shot. And behind the curtain is this great, great trepidation. Will we succeed? What is it that we have created that gives us confidence that we can succeed? And what doubt and uncertainty do we have to question whether we have enough and recognize that we may not indeed have enough? This prayer, Unattainable Prayer, is a behind the curtain prayer. It's the one that opens up all of the elaborate and elegant constructions of our magnificent epic novels, our magnificent epic feature film productions of our lives, and recognizes the simplicity, the frailty, the vulnerability of our humanity. And all the costumes and all the accoutrement that we put on in order for us to be worthy of the great story that we're telling is irrelevant when we connect deeply to that almost primal experience of not being certain that our humanity is enough. So the first expletive comes from a book that was actually published, I believe, earlier this year or last year. It's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving an FCK. And it's all about the reality of caring how other people perceive our actions. and stripping down our own pretense and our own challenges to recognize that without our humanity at its core, without a recognition or acknowledgement, identification with that, everything that we build and construct is like a sandcastle. So in the scene, the reason that I want to introduce this is because it involves just one incredible chapter where he talks about being on the Cape of Good Horn. I believe it's down in the southernmost tip of the African continent. And he walks to the edge. Now, have you ever walked to the edge of a rock precipice? What immediately happens in your body at that time? Something primal emerges within us. We get fearful. That is a natural instinct to be afraid to take the next step. Why? Because we know that if we slip and we fall, it is certainly going to be our demise. That urge within us, you can't teach it. You can't even protect from it. It exists. It is. It's what happens when you move the curtain and strip down all the pretense, and no more costumes, and you see yourself at your most elemental, simple, vulnerable core. That there is a part of you that has that concern that the very next step that you may take would be at your own peril. So he writes in the book talking about that moment and how he continually edges forward, not caring that he's going to potentially slip and die. In fact, he's incredibly fearful, but he pushes himself. He pushes himself a little bit further. Have you ever done that yourself? Have you ever been in a place where you have gone to the precipice, when you've gone to the ledge, when you've been at a leading edge and you've been afraid something inside of you has bubbled up and you've been so afraid of taking the next step that you've questioned whether or not you could do it? We've all been in that place. It's something that, like I said, is a part of our nature as human beings. But how many times have you overcome that fear? How many times did you take the next step? How many times that when you took the next step, you found that all of that anxiety and that concern and that fear for what might come next wasn't actually true? And how many times, just to sort of keep it in our imaginative place, how many times were you very happy that you didn't take that next step? Because you knew that if you took the next step, you would for sure be in trouble. Determining that moment, those touch points, that's real. That's spirituality. That's religious experience. If you want to know what it means to pray, you feel it in that moment. Finding the words and expressing them with meaning and purpose is what Judaism is trying to capture in a prayer like the Unattainable Prayer. So I'm going to save my second expletive for the next book that we're going to be reading. And let's jump into our text. So that was my little introduction. And the question that you have to ask yourself is, when you're on the precipice, do you take one step forward, or do you know that you've gone far enough? Let's study together. There you go. It's a little meta when you see the Facebook posting on the screen. That's good. Everybody give me a thumbs up. Are you guys doing great? I'm feeling energetic about the Unattainable Prayer, which is ironic because it's scary and we should be somber about this, but it's not Rosh Hashanah and it's not Yom Kippur. We're not praying these words right now. We're going to learn them so that when we do have the opportunity to utter them in the midst of prayer, we will do so with the whole heart as intended. Okay, so Unattainable. Let us describe the great holiness of this day. Unattainable. It's upon us the responsibility to take hold of the great holiness of this day, for it is awesome and frightening. On this day, your kingship, that is God's kingship, is uplifted, and your throne is established with kindness, and you sit upon it in truth. This is the image that we're creating. God is a king. God is on the throne. It is a throne that is established with kindness and truth. True that you are judge, admonisher, knower, and witness, and you inscribe, seal, record, and count, and recall all forgotten things. Even if we are the ones who are creating this imaginative experience, there's more that we know or that we forgot we knew. That's the precipice moment. God's on the other side. And the question is, can we take another step to get closer, safer? You open the book of records and read of itself, and the signature of every person is in it. A great shofar is sounded, and a silent, gentle voice is heard. And the angels are alarmed. Pangs of fear and trembling seize them as they declare, behold, the day of judgment. The heavenly host is arranged in judgment, for they are not guiltless in your eyes in judgment. All humankind pass before you like young sheep. As a shepherd inspects his flock, making his sheep pass under his rod, so do you cause to pass, count, number, and review the soul of every living being, determining the lifespan of every creature, and you record the decree of their judgment. So the first paragraph of this is the image of God and us. God sits on the throne of kindness and truth, and humankind passes before God like a shepherd counting sheep. And as God is reviewing each and every human soul, like a shepherd does to his flock, God is making decisions about who will live and who will die. On Rosh Hashanah, their decree is inscribed, and on Yom Kippur, it is sealed. How many will pass away and how many will be created? Who will live and who will die? Who will come to his timely end and who to an untimely end? Who will perish by fire and who by water? Who by sword and who by beast? Who by hunger and who by thirst? Who by earthquake and who by plague? Who by strangling and who by stoning? Oi, who will be at rest and who will wander about? Who will have serenity and who will be confused? Who will be tranquil and who will be tormented? Who will become poor and who will become wealthy? Who will be brought to a low state and who will be uplifted? Barosh Hashanah Yikatevun. Beautiful melody. Yom Kippur Yechatevun. On Rosh Hashanah it's written, and on Yom Kippur it will be sealed. And we say L'Shana Tova Yichatevun, right? This is the central theme of Rosh Hashanah. It's written, and on Yom Kippur it's sealed. L'Shana Tova Yichatevun, and we also say V'techatevun, and you will be sealed. And when we come to Yom Kippur, we say Gemar Chatima Tova. May you finish this holiday, Gemar Chatima, with a seal, a good signature from God, Tova. But repentance, U'teshuva, U'tefila, U'tzedakah, Ma'avirim, and Roah Gezelah. I need Cantor Fox to sing for me because he does it much better. But we know that part, right? But even though God is telling us which book we're going to be in, the book of life or the book of death, who's going to be poor and who's going to be wealthy, who's going to be at ill at ease and who's going to be at rest, right? Tshuva, tefillah, and tzedakah, it says annul this evil decree. So we're going to have to talk about that because the word is ma'avirim, not necessarily annul, but we'll understand what its intention is a little bit. So just to go for the last of the prayer, just so you can read the prayer, and then we'll stop. For as your name, so is your praise. You are slow to anger and easy to pacify. For you do not desire death for the sinner, but that he turn from his evil way and live. And even until his dying day, you wait for him. If he repents, you immediately accept him. True, you are their creator, and you know their impulse that they are but flesh and blood. Man, his beginning is from dust and ends in dust, risking his life, giving his bread. He is like a potsherd that is breakable, like grass that withers, like a flower that fades, like the shadow that passes, like the cloud that vanishes, like the wind that blows, like the dust that flies, and like a fleeting dream. But you are the King, the Almighty, the everlasting God. So that's the prayer of Unattainable Prayer, and we're going to study it and break it down like we've been breaking it down some of the other prayers. Tonight we need to talk a little bit about the history. Where did a prayer like this come from? Because it's really legendary and such an important part of the narrative. And we carry the story into this moment because we resonate with the story as we begin to tell our own. And that's the second part of what we'll talk about, memory. How this is more than just hearing that beautiful melody year after year, which I have to say, as a child growing up and not having many years of Rosh Hashanah in my life, knowing that I heard those melodies once again when I returned to the synagogue and I was a participant in religious life in the Jewish community, that at that moment, hearing those words, it was like a homecoming, right? It's like Kol Nidre, as we discussed last week. There are just certain words that bring it back. So there's certain memory, not only with the melodies, but also with the idea. And the return to the idea is a very important concept we're going to discuss. Then we have to deal with like the present tense of this. What is it that we're doing, not from history and the story that we carry and what we remember, but what do we do with it now? How do we contend with it now? And finally, how do we project into the future? Because the sense of being written into a book of life and a book of death, and we stand with trepidation, and we may very well have been written into the book of death this year. We have another year to return to. And through that future journey, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to be prepared to say this again next year? What will have changed within us so that we can stand with the same awe and reverence that we hope to express each and every year when these words are recited in the congregation? Any comments, any questions so far? I just love having you all here. So just go ahead and type it into the chat box. I'm paying very close attention on 3 devices. I've got this on my computer, I've got it on my iPad, and I've got it on my iPhone. Boy, I connected, and it is really nice and wonderful to learn with you. So go ahead, and if you have any comments to add, feel free to do so. I'm going to continue on, and we're going to talk about the history of the story. And if you have a comment, I'll respond. Okay. Where did a prayer like this come from? It's not the Shema. It's not the V'ahavta. It's not the Amidah. How did it get inserted into the Musaf prayers? So it's right at the moment, right before you're about to recite what's known as the Kiddusha, which is the great sanctification of God's name. Why is it at that moment, which is a pinnacle moment? It is a denouement of prayer. Why at that moment do we pause and insert this prayer? So the legend has it as this, and I copied it and added it for you. Good evening, friends. Good evening, Rabbi Biller from Flushing, New York. It's good to see you. Rabbi Amnon of Mayence, a great scholar, a person of wealth, a handsome man of noble ancestry, was under great pressure from the lords and archbishop of the city to change his faith and adopt their religion. He repeatedly ignored them, but on one occasion, in order to put them off, he asked for 3 days to consider their request. Afterwards, he was heartbroken because he had given the impression that he might actually consider renouncing his belief in the one living God. He refused food or drink, weeping bitterly over his lapse. He refused to accept the sympathy and consolation of relatives and friends. At the end of the 3 days, he was summoned by the archbishop, but he ignored the summons. A distinguished delegation was sent to ask him to appear at the court, but he refused them. Finally, notice again, a third time, he was brought before the court by force, and the archbishop demanded, "Why did you not come and answer me as you promised?" Rabbi Amnon answered, "As a punishment, you should have my tongue cut out, because my tongue deceived you." Rabbi Amnon thought to sanctify God's name in this manner, since his tongue had uttered such a promise. So in other words, he was accepting punishment, and he figured that let this be his penance of having his tongue cut out because he misled them with his words. The archbishop replied, "No, I will not cut out your tongue, for it spoke well. Instead, I will cut off your feet, for they did not bring you to me." The tyrant ordered that his hands and feet be cut off in piecemeal fashion, asking him at each interval if he was willing to renounce his faith. He was finally released and sent home with his severed and mutilated limbs beside him in bed. I should have given you a warning that this is a brutal story, and I hope that I have not disturbed you. This is a part of our tradition. The holiday of Rosh Hashanah was at hand, and the rabbi, dying from the effects of his wounds, was at his own request carried into the synagogue, bringing his severed limbs with him. When the Chazan was about to recite the Kiddusha, the part of the prayer service that we just mentioned, Rabbi Amnon asked him to stop, saying, "Pause that I may sanctify his most holy name." And he said in a loud voice, "Uvechen ulecha ta'aleh Kiddusha." And so therefore, and for you, will rise up this sanctification, this presence and holy encounter. And thus may his sanctification ascend to you, inferring that with his terrible suffering, he had sanctified God's name. He then began reciting the Unattainment Prayer. This was his poem. And with the words, Emet ki atahu dayan umochia. It is true that you are the judge and you are the proof. True that you are the judge and the admonisher. And he indicated his acceptance of God's divine judgment. And with the words, V'tichtov ekazar dina. And God writes the decree of his judgment in the book of life or the book of death. And he recorded the decree of their judgments. He manifested his belief that his faith had been decreed on Rosh Hashanah. But Rosh Hashanah yikatevu, Yom Kippur yechatevu. No sooner had he finished the prayer when he expired. 3 days later, he appeared to Rabbi Clonimus ben Meshulam in a dream and taught him that this prayer, asking him to introduce it to all congregations as a testimonial and as a memorial for him. This prayer has been formed a portion of our service ever since. So you can look at, for the Unattainment Prayer explanation. It has slight variations of what I've shared with you here, but they're all virtually the same. And so the first time that the prayer actually appears is in a book called the Or Zarua, which was one of the sort of early printed prayer books that we have in our collective history. And in the Or Zarua, it shows up in his prayer in the space that was described by Rabbi Am. And the attribution is certainly quite legendary. And I won't doubt the veracity of any of the elements of the story as it's been given to us, because I don't think that the truth and its veracity is what we're hoping to achieve here. I hope that it was that kind of same kind of kishka experience that you had when you thought about that moment when you stood on the precipice. Or maybe it's the Kishka experience when you're hearing those words, mi ba'esh, mi ba'mayim, mi ba'magefa, mi ba'aniyut, mi ba'ashibu. Whether any of those are our decrees, something in our Kishka starts to resonate right now. More than the beating of our chest as we're saying Hashamnu, more than the great Aleinu when we bow our bodies down and prostrate ourselves low in order to be worthy of the presence of God. This is the moment when we hear those words. This is the core moment. And the core moment is always carrying that history. I've been reading a little bit about World War II stories, which sometimes we, as the history of the Shoah begins to fade in the distance as the survivors slowly fade into eternity. There was a story of a partisan who, in the story of hiding, had to pretend that he was a peasant hiding in the priest's house, the very same priest that was the captain of the brigade that was going out and finding the Jews and turning them over to the Nazis. And in his disguise, he had to so severely pretend that he was one of them, to the moment where, just for example, one of the other women who worked in the priest's home I asked him, you don't swear like the other people. You're different than them. And he knew that in order to save his life, he had to act like them. And so he begins to swear and curse and act as disrespectful as she was accustomed to in order for him to blend in. And while he survived, the end of the story is always carrying that kind of piece of himself that said that he wasn't being his true self. And you ask Rabbi Amnon, was your suffering worth it? The 3 days that you asked, why didn't you just go and say you weren't ready? You weren't going to convert and your life would be taken from you. But all of that doubt and all of that fear that you carried with you, that was perhaps far worse a punishment for your suffering than what the Archbishop did to you. And that's why he wrote these prayers for us to hear, so that as we listen and we go through it ourselves, we may ask ourselves the questions alike. What are we suffering from? What are we allowing ourselves to suffer in order for us to maintain the costumes, the protections that keep our vulnerabilities what we feel to be safe? Not only do we have the history of Rabbi Amnon as a part of our experience of the prayer, but we have these words. On Rosh Hashanah, the decree is inscribed, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. And we sang it. Let's sing it again. Rosh Hashanah Tika Tehebu, Yom Kippur Yecha Tehebu. On the new year, the decree is written into the book of life, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. The book of life was my addition, because I want all of us to be written into the book of life this year. So what's the memory? Not only is it the memory of the melody, but it's also the memory of what has happened and transpired in the year before. And there's a recognition, I hope for you, when you hear this, that the inscription of the book of life for the year to come was already given to you. So ask yourself the question, what did you do with that book? Did you continue to write moments that were affirmations of life? Or did you write into that book moments which limited you and excluded you, isolated you from the presence of others, from the possibility of doing the courageous and heroic act? Those moments when you stand on the precipice and wonder if taking the next step is going to be at your peril, or it's one step closer to a truth, a sense of confidence, and a sense of pride in knowing that you can do it, that you can be everything that you imagined yourself to be. The memory of that is something that we have to carry in this moment. And then we carry it into the present. So this is the second expletive. And another great book that I highly recommend from Princeton professor, I believe it's of either sociology or philosophy. I think he's a philosophy professor at Princeton University. His name is Harry Frankfurt. And the book is called On Bullsh. You see the star? I think you can figure it out. I just figured this is a PG rated class. It's being broadcast all around. I don't want somebody to misinterpret anything that's being said here, but you know what the star is covering up. So the book is a wonderful book. It's not very long. It's maybe 100 pages, it's like 80 to 100 pages. And in that book, he literally defines what is this thing called BS. And it's beautiful because, first of all, we sort of wriggle in our seats when we talk about it, right? Like, who wants to talk about that idea of BS? But we all know that it exists. And the reason that we're going to study it now is because part of the definition of what makes BS BS is the definition not of telling lies, nor of telling the truth, but it's this very, very complicated, gray, muddy middle that so many of us exist in. And sometimes we speak with a certain confidence and veracity that what we're saying is the truth. Just for example, right? This is the most amazing meal I've ever eaten in my life. Is it really the most amazing meal? No, you're probably being courteous. Maybe it really is the most amazing meal. And maybe you've only said that once in your life. Because, to be honest about that would be that you would only say it once. But to do that and to be courteous and kind for whatever it is, usually the person that is a performer of BS is doing it to kind of gain or persuade other people to have affection for them, to love them, even though they may be uncertain that the truth is not very loving inside of them. So let's play with that idea with the backdrop of Unattainable Prayer as we read just a couple of these paragraphs. A person's normal habit of attending to the way things are may become attenuated or lost. So first of all, being honest means recognizing that things are the way they are. Another way of saying this in an expletive is SHIT happens. Stuff happens, right? We can blame, or we can take credit, or we can give explanations, and we can kind of qualify what it is that we experience. But sometimes our efforts so hard to try and identify the way that things are, we can lose it. Someone who lies and someone who tells the truth are playing on opposite sides, so to speak, in the same game. Each responds to the facts as he understands them, while the response to the other side, the response of the other defies that authority and refuses to meet its demands, right? So if the game is truth or lie, right, the person who speaks truth is responding to the facts as he or she understands them, okay? Or somebody knows the truth and is deliberately and overtly avoiding the truth to gain a certain advantage. The bull ignores these demands altogether. He does not reject the authority of the truth as the liar does and oppose himself to it. He pays no attention to it at all. By virtue of this, BS is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. Somebody who is busy with the project of BS doesn't have any authority of truth, right? A person who lies respects the truth, and so therefore tries to tell a counter truth, a completely different narrative to cover up their recognition that the truth is the truth. Or maybe they don't want to confront the truth because it's too hard or it's something that would be harmful to them. But somebody who's a BSer doesn't pay attention to truth at all. The truth doesn't matter because all the thing that a BSer is concerned about is the BSer. BSer just wants to be loved. So one of the things that's happening when we're hearing this prayer, Unattainable Prayer, is whether or not we're going to confront the truth of it. That there is a fate that exists beyond our control. And our acceptance of it isn't a weakness. It doesn't diminish our experience, but it's an empowerment. And as we're learned, teshuvah and tefillah and tzedakah, these particular acts of repentance or of changing your behavior, of prayer, the idea of like expressing your soul, and also acts of kindness and of justice and of care for the world. Those are things that avert the severity of the decree. Somebody who is involved with BS isn't concerned about tshuva or tefillah and tzedakah. All they're concerned about is persuading you to like them. So when we hear this prayer, it's not that we look like, the prettiest sheep in the flock, coif our hair and dress in our finest clothes and walk into the synagogue with our fanciest machzor and our nicest shoes, and we hope that God sees the best of us. What happens is The person who is sincere in presenting themselves before this moment recognizes that who they are is what God wants to see the most. Who they are, not who they see themselves as being, who they like to be, or who they think God would like them to be, but who they are is what God wants to see. The BSer is not concerned with that. Here's one more quote, and let me stop. Thus, the production of BS is stimulated whenever a person's obligations and opportunities to speak about some topic exceed his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to that topic. Right? So this is like, this is our more conventional definition of a BSer, right? This is the person who is like, stitching and stitching and stitching a story. It's the most amazing and the most important. Boy, there's so many like popular examples in our news streams today to give you a sense of what it's meant here. The most, the amazing, the bestest, the hardest, all of the things that are being said is filled with a bunch of baloney. Because a person who speaks about that exceeds the knowledge that's necessary and relevant. So when a person is at the edge and is on the precipice and doesn't know to take that step any further, at that moment, the BSer comes in and says, look, it's blue skies beyond. Go, you go take a walk off the cliff. I'm not going to do it, but you go do it. As opposed to the person who is humble enough, who recognizes their humanity and their limitations. And at that moment, that person says, I'm not sure if I'm able to take the next step. And so therefore I need some help, some confidence. And so therefore we pray this prayer to give us the confidence to take the next step. In other words, let's go back to the prayer. How many will pass away and how many will be created? Who will live and who will die? Who will come to his timely end and who to his untimely end? That whole image of who will live and who will die, who will perish by fire and water, and who will wander about and be confused and will have serenity. Who will be all of those things? Rabbi Amnon, who's suffering and he's reciting these words. He's not admonishing us. He's not telling us to recognize that this is the way of the world, but he's saying this is what it means to ask for help. Because we don't know. We don't know who. Because the who could be the person that we love right next to us, or it could be the friend in our community, or it could be us. So the present challenge with this prayer is precisely what we've been building up to. We're the directors. We're the ones that create our own fate. And look at us, we have lighting, and we have cameras, and we have scripts, and we have staging, and we have all these incredible things to say, look at this beautiful, blessed life that we have. And then behind the curtain, we see all the things that if anybody's in the Hollywood entertainment industry, or you've ever watched The Wizard of Oz, behind the curtain of the great Oz is just a simple man with just a very, very simple dream. And the same thing with us behind the curtain is a very simple, vulnerable, tender human being with fears and weaknesses and flaws and failures. And as we pull the curtain away, the director is not the one who paints a better picture of us, but the one who paints the truest picture of us. And in painting the truest picture of us, you have to ask the question, who are you? Who are you that will be one that is moved by fire or moved by water or moved by lightning or moved by mental discomfort? Who will be serene? Who will be wealthy? Who will be loved and who will be accepted? We don't have to answer the question, but we have to ask it. And in the very effort of asking the question, we then understand the most important part of the prayer, which is the future part. So let's read it. So our future. Uteshuva, utefila, utsadaka, ma'avirin, et roa hagazera. So this actually comes from rabbinic tradition. This isn't Rabbi Amnon's alone. Actually, it comes from a book called Midrash Rabbah, which is one of the ancient interpretive texts. And it's really coming out of a whole series of questions about the rabbis when they confront their flaws and they confront sins. And they're trying to understand, like, what are the consequences? You know, perhaps even in the backdrop, the consequences were corrected when a temple stood with sacrifices. So because that was their reality in their existence, something had to replace that. You couldn't just bring a lamb or a bull if it was a really bad sin, or some grain or some doves or whatever, right? You had to do something. So teshuvah, which is repentance, tefillah, which is prayer, and tzedakah, it says they avert the severity of our decree. I bolded severity because it's important to understand that it's not an annulment. It's not like if you just do tshuva and you do tefillah and tzedakah, that the decree doesn't come. That's actually probably very helpful because so many of us are sometimes afflicted with challenges and struggles that come from not from our own accord. And because we suffer, that suffering, we want to put it into a context, but sometimes it's an inexplicable context. But it's rather not about the consequences of the experience of life. It's not the consequences of our living that are of concern, but our response. Our response is critical to understanding how we should handle our suffering, how we should handle our joy, how we should handle our learning, how we should handle our disappointment. So teshuvah, which we've talked quite a bit about, is this whole idea that says you can change. All that stuff, that's that primitive fear that's in you, the standing on the precipice and the concern about taking the next step, you can take the next step. You may need some help. You may need to be bolstered up with support. You may need to have a rope tied behind your belt buckle to make sure that you don't fall over the cliff. That's fine. You still take the next step, because taking the next step is what it means to be alive, and what it means to be human, and what it means to affirm your identity. It's easy for us to be sheltered within our realm and to just understand that life is a consequence of the world that we create. But it's not real living. Real living is in those encounters. And those encounters happen with other people. Those encounters happen with unfamiliar circumstances. Those encounters happen sometimes from the serendipity of life. Strangers that we meet along the way, strange experiences that compel us to act, hopefully from our best places. Teshuvah is the mechanism that enables us to do that. So how does it avert the future? It says that we are willing to grow. We are willing to change. We are engaged in that practice because we believe that change is possible. That belief is kind of a fundamental, foundational thing in Judaism. There are many religious practices that say that, God has defined everything in that book of life, counting us as sheep and saying, now's our time. And there's certainly a lot to believe in that. But this last line, which is so crucial, you have to say it with the rest of the prayer. It's not an addition. It wasn't thrown as an afterthought. But it really is Rabbi Amnon's best understanding of his moment. It's what redeems him in the story. Is that he does teshuvah, and he engages in prayer. And perhaps you could even say he performs an act of tzedakah, or righteousness, justice, by presenting himself in all of his infirmity, his morbidity. And he says these words to acknowledge his failure and also to engage in God's presence. So I want to share with you one last part of Unattainable Prayer, and then we'll conclude. This is Leonard Cohen, who is just, Zichrono Libracha, passed away in 2018. And he wrote a song called Who by Fire. And I don't know if you like his music, but he's a poet. And his music, it's haunting and beautiful. And this is one of those haunting, beautiful pieces. And it's clear that he took this right out of Unattainable Prayer. He had a strange relationship with Judaism, growing up in a traditional household, and then perhaps adopting an unconventional practice of Jewish life, but he was always a member of an Orthodox synagogue. And when he died in 2018, it was there that he was buried in Montreal. So he writes these words: and who by fire, who by water, who in the sunshine, who in the nighttime, who by high ordeal, who by common trial, who in your merry, merry month of May, who by very slow decay, and who shall I say is calling? And who in her lonely slip, and who by barbiturate, who in the realms of love, and who by something blunt, who by avalanche, who by powder, who for his greed, who for his hunger, and who shall I say is calm? And who by brave ascent, and who by accident, who in solitude, who in this mirror, who by his lady's command, who by his own hand, who in mortal chains, who in power, and who shall I say is calm? It's haunting, especially look it up on YouTube or online and just listen to the music. It's just haunting. But clearly he, in the middle of his rendition of the Unattainable Prayer, he asks a great question. He says, and who shall I say is calm? As if to interpret the meaning of the prayer. It's not the who of a finger that we point around the room. And for us to kind of look at somebody else and say, my God, this could be the year of your illness, or the year of your wealth, and the year of your success. But it's the interior question. The who is you? So when he asks, who shall I say is calling? What a powerful question that you could ask yourself. Who are you that's calling for God at this time? Who is the person that is standing in the midst of prayer this year in front of a little green light or in front of a TV screen, reading these words with all of their haunting melody and with all of their penetrating substance, with all of the things that we've begun to study tonight? Who are you to recite these words? This is the great challenge of Unattainable Prayer, is for you to be able to say, I am the one that's calling. Behind the curtain, there I stand with everything in all my grandeur and all my frailty, with all of my success and all of my failure. And I am going to stand here, and I'm going to make the commitment that as I am counted like one of the sheep, just among the flock of your people and of humanity, my commitment to tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah is going to soften whatever fate you and the world has for me. It's not that we can completely eradicate all the variables that afflict us with suffering in our lives. We can't. But tshuva and tefillah and tzedakah help us to reduce and minimize the impact of that. So when Leonard Cohen asks you, who shall we say is calling, you know for sure that you should respond saying, I'm the one who's calling. And when you ask yourself, who is the person that you consider yourself to be? That work is what we set about in our project through the holidays to begin to define. It's actually kind of like a chilling and shuddering moment. It's the moment when we stand on the precipice. It's the moment when we're looking at the stage We've got our lights and we've got our cameras and we've got the stage settings, and we're pulling behind the curtain and we're peering inside. And the star of the epic production, the full-length feature film, is you. You're the star. And you are in the star of this grand epic called your life. The question that you ask for yourself, who shall God say is called, is the person that I hope that you aspire to be. Somebody that's filled with tshuva, somebody that's filled with tefillah, with prayer and self-reflection and self-awareness, person who is filled with tzedakah, with righteous behavior and a sense of commitment to that. If you can be that person, then these prayers they're not an obstacle to overcome, but they're an embrace that the stage has been set, that the moment when you, as the director of your life, and God as the director of all creation, meet in a nexus, begin to walk in the path together. That's the challenge of the holidays. That's how Unattainment prepares us for that. So let me pause, and if there's any comments or contributions to that, I welcome you, and I'm so glad that you are all here with me tonight. This concludes our learning. Let me make sure that I just got all my favorite texts out of there. And we did. And please look it up, Who by Fire by Leonard Cohen. Okay, it's a wonderful thing. I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful evening. Thank you so much for learning with me. So come back. We've got one more week. It's when we're going to wrap up everything that we've been learning in this prayer. We're calling it Prayer Mastery, the High Holiday Edition. And we're going to be bringing it all home and trying to capture what we have studied together and hopefully truly be ready to embrace the holidays this season with a new sense and a deeper sense of the power that they can have in our lives. Have a great evening. Thanks for learning with me. Take care.